Diana Monroe froze at Gate 27 when she saw a man in a plain jacket restore the collapsed routing system with nothing but a borrowed terminal and quiet keystrokes. 15 years earlier, she had betrayed Ryan Bennett, destroyed his career, revoked his license, and erased him from the aviation industry while he raised his 5-year-old daughter alone. She had told herself he was gone. She had told herself she had been necessary. But tonight, in a rain-soaked airport falling apart around her, Ryan stood calm and certain, and utterly unmoved. He looked up. "You still remember Gate 27, don't you?" But Diana did not yet know that Ryan had not come for revenge. He had come to save the person who destroyed him. The storm arrived without warning over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport on a November night that seemed designed for reckoning. Rain came in thick, slanted curtains against the terminal glass, and wind dragged across the tarmac in low gusts that made the boarding bridges shudder. Inside, the airport hummed with the nervous energy that builds when flights go wrong, and people realize the machinery they trust is not, after all, infallible. Flight boards flickered. Gate agents reached for radios and found no answers. Somewhere deep in the secondary coordination network, a cascade error was quietly eating through the routing tables that kept a dozen international departures synchronized. Diana Monroe arrived at Seattle-Tacoma on the last calm flight before the disruption took hold, stepping off the jet bridge with the composure of a woman who had spent 15 years being watched. She was 45, and she wore that age the way she wore everything with intention, without softness. Ella Brooks was already beside her with the evening's briefing. Tomorrow, Monroe Aerotech would unveil its new aviation coordination platform at a conference that had drawn representatives from 11 countries. Tonight, Diana needed a car and a hotel room, and 8 hours of sleep she already knew she would not get. She moved through the terminal without looking up, the way powerful people do when they have grown accustomed to being recognized and have not yet decided whether they enjoy it. The trouble at Gate 27 began the way serious technical failures almost always do, not with an explosion, but with a quiet inconsistency in a data stream that no one was watching closely enough. The secondary coordination system, tasked with managing gate assignments and weight distribution for the overnight international roster, began returning bad frequency pairs. 2 departure gates tried to claim the same communications channel. A third stopped receiving ground data entirely. An airport technician named Marcus Webb, 26 years old and 3 months into the role, stared at a screen full of red indicators and understood only that something had gone wrong that no one around him could explain. His supervisor was on the phone. His supervisor's supervisor was unavailable. The window to resolve the problem before it cascaded into the primary departure grid was narrowing fast. No one paid particular attention to the man and the young woman seated near the Gate 27 windows. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered but unhurried in a canvas field jacket that had been washed too many times to hold its shape. She was 20, with her father's same dark eyes, reading a textbook thick enough to stop a door. They had arrived early for the overnight flight, the way people do who have learned that airports are unpredictable, and they were the only 2 in the gate area who seemed entirely at ease with the chaos building around them. Ryan Bennett watched Marcus Webb's hands move across the keyboard for a moment. Then he watched the error code cycling on the secondary display. Then he set down his coffee. He did not announce himself. He simply walked to the workstation and said, in the quiet tone of someone stating a fact about weather, that the system was operating on the wrong backup frequency cluster, that the primary and secondary had swapped handshake protocols during the last software push, and the fix was a manual rebind of the frequency pair, not a full reboot. Marcus stared at him. 2 other technicians who had appeared from somewhere along the corridor stared at him too. Ryan asked if someone could pull up the routing configuration. They pulled it up. He pointed to a single line of the frequency assignment table, explained what was wrong in 3 sentences, and told them exactly what to change. They changed it. The cascade error stopped. The boards began to stabilize. Gate 27 came back online first, and then the rest followed in sequence. like street lamps recovering from a power flicker. Diana had seen the disruption from 30 yards away and had walked toward it because it was her industry, and because the Monroe Aerotech name was already somewhere in the technical documentation for this system, and because she had not spent 15 years building a reputation for composure, only to stand at a distance while something bearing her company's fingerprints malfunctioned. She was almost at the workstation when the screens cleared. The technicians were turning to the man in the field jacket with gratitude that had nowhere to land, because he was already stepping back, already reaching for his coffee. She saw his boarding pass on the seat beside the young woman. She saw the name printed on it. The air left the room. Ryan Bennett. All of the noise of the terminal, the gate announcements, the rain on the glass, the hum of 100 conversations seemed to pull back at once, the way sound does before something breaks. He looked up from the workstation and found her face without searching, as though he had always known exactly where she would be standing. "You still remember Gate 27, don't you?" he said. He did not say it with cruelty. He did not say it with grief. He said it the way a man says something he has carried so long that it no longer has any weight, which is the most devastating way to say it. 15 years before that November rain, Chicago in September had the particular quality of a city that had not yet accepted that summer was over. Monroe Aerotech occupied 5 floors of a glass and steel tower near O'Hare, and the building smelled of recirculated air and quiet ambition, and the people who worked inside it had learned to move fast and speak carefully, and never let their uncertainty show in a room full of superiors. Ryan Bennett did not move fast, did not speak carefully, and was visibly uncertain about social cues and office politics. But he was never uncertain about systems. He could look at a block of navigation code the way other people look at a familiar face, immediately, completely, without consciously parsing what he was seeing. He had not come from money. He had graduated from a state school on a series of scholarships and 1 federal grant, worked his way through 2 internships at regional carriers, and been hired at Monroe Aerotech on the strength of a diagnostic memo he submitted during a technical assessment that was supposed to be a formality. His evaluator passed the memo up 3 levels before lunch. He was 29 years old, and he wore the same 3 dress shirts on rotation, and none of this mattered to anyone who had read the memo. He was also raising a 5-year-old alone. His wife, Catherine, had died of a sudden cardiac arrhythmia 18 months earlier, and Ryan had handled this the way he handled system failures. He assessed what could be repaired and rebuilt the rest from available components. He woke Madison each morning, made her breakfast, walked her to school, and drove to O'Hare, and did the job that kept the lights on. He did not complain about any of this, because complaining required an audience. And Ryan had never been interested in performing his grief for anyone. Diana Monroe was not yet the name on the building. She was the vice president of strategic development, 30 years old, and already being scrutinized by a board that viewed her age and her gender as variables requiring constant testing. She was sharp, controlled, and relentless in a way that people in the aviation industry tended to mistake for coldness, when what it actually was fear. Fear of being seen as insufficient, fear of the quiet conversations that happened after she left rooms, fear that the one mistake that finished her was somewhere just ahead. She needed a win. The board had made that clear in the particular way boards make things clear, through tone, through silence, through the careful arrangement of sentences that never quite said the thing they meant. The crisis that brought Diana and Ryan into the same orbit was a navigation contract worth $240 million that had begun to disintegrate because of a corrupted handshake sequence in the flight management interface. The vendor blamed Monroe's integration team. Monroe's integration team blamed the vendor. The deadline was 48 hours away, and no one was willing to own the problem. Ryan stayed in the technical lab until 2 in the morning, working alone with a cold cup of coffee and a printed circuit schematic taped to the wall, and found the error buried 4 layers deep in the synchronization logic. By the time Diana arrived at 6 the next morning, the system was clean, and the contract was intact. and there was no one in the lab except a tired young engineer with his coat on, and a sleeping child curled beneath the work table with a stuffed bear pressed against her cheek. Diana stood in the doorway for a long time before Ryan looked up. He did not explain. He just said that Madison had a cold, and her daycare was closed, and he had not known what else to do. Diana looked at the repaired diagnostic display. Then she looked at the child. Then she said, "You saved the contract." Ryan said he had only found the error. And Diana understood, for the first time, that she was looking at someone who genuinely did not understand his own value, which is the rarest kind of person, and the most dangerous to betray. The system Ryan had been quietly developing for 2 years existed in his notes under the working title Skybridge, and it solved a problem the aviation industry had been circling for a decade without resolution. Commercial flight management systems were robust under ideal conditions. They were considerably less robust when those conditions failed, when solar interference degraded GPS fidelity, when ground station overloads created signal congestion, when a primary navigation relay went dark mid-approach. Standard backup protocols could handle single-point failures. They were not designed for cascading multi-source degradation, which happened rarely enough to be theoretical until the moment it happened to an aircraft over water and became something else entirely. Skybridge was a dynamic rerouting architecture that allowed a navigation system to reconstruct reliable positional data from a distributed array of low-priority signal sources, weighting and blending them in real time as primary inputs degraded. It was elegant in the way that all good engineering is elegant. It made the complex invisible by doing the hard work quietly. Ryan had not told anyone about it for the first 18 months. He had built it in margins in late evenings after Madison was asleep, in the hour before his shift began, on weekends when the apartment was quiet enough to think. He brought it to Diana, because she was the only person at Monroe Aerotech he trusted, and because by that point the line between professional trust and something less easily categorized had blurred in ways neither of them had spoken aloud. They had worked late together 3 times. With Madison asleep on the couch in Diana's office, talking about systems theory and the particular loneliness of being very good at something in a room full of people who only half understood it. Ryan told Diana about Skybridge on a quiet Thursday evening, laying out the architecture on a whiteboard with the care of someone who has rehearsed a confession. Diana understood it immediately. She also understood what it meant for the company and for herself. Owen Price understood it too, though he came to that understanding through different means. Owen was the chief operating officer, 51 years old, with a manner polished to a gloss and a mind always working 2 moves ahead. He had not built anything of technical significance in his career. His talent was for acquisition of credit, of influence, of other people's work. When Owen learned about Skybridge through a report he was not supposed to have seen, he spent a week considering his options and arrived at the conclusion that Ryan Bennett's continued presence at Monroe Aerotech represented an accelerating threat to his own position. Not because Ryan was ambitious, precisely because he was not. An ambitious engineer could be managed, offered a title, given credit in press releases, brought into the circle just enough to feel seen. Ryan was not interested in those things. Owen began quietly. He redirected internal testing data, replacing Ryan's calibration results with outputs from a corrupted source dataset accessed through a shared administrator account. He submitted a safety assessment under a colleague's name that raised unverified concerns about Skybridge's performance margins. He sent 3 internal communications formatted to resemble Ryan's own correspondence to 2 board members and the head of safety compliance, casting doubt on whether Ryan had been fully transparent about a simulated failure scenario from March. And he sat across from Diana in her office one afternoon, in his unhurried way, and said, "You can care for someone and still recognize that they are becoming a liability. The question is which one you can afford." Diana said nothing, but Owen had planted what he came to plant, and he knew it. The Skybridge demonstration was scheduled for the first Wednesday in October. in the main simulation suite on the 4th floor, with the full board present along with 2 external safety certification panels, a delegation from a major European carrier considering a $300 million integration contract, and 3 members of the press admitted under strict embargo. Ryan arrived early, having been in the building since 5 in the morning running final validation checks with 2 junior engineers. Madison was outside in the hallway on a small padded bench with her stuffed bear and a box of apple juice, wearing the green dress she wore on what she called important days. Ryan had explained what important days were. Days when the work you had been doing in private got to come out into the light. Owen arrived last, which was his custom, and took the position at the back wall nearest the exit, which was not incidental. Diana stood near the front, in the precise posture of someone managing competing anxieties behind a composed exterior. She glanced at Ryan once when he came in. He nodded. She did not nod back, which he registered but did not interpret, because Ryan did not spend much energy interpreting things that were not systems. The demonstration began at 9. Skybridge performed the first 3 test sequences perfectly multi-source signal integration, graceful degradation under staged primary failure, autonomous rerouting under simulated GPS shadow. The junior engineers exchanged a quiet look of relief. Ryan kept his eyes on the output panel, watching the numbers with the attention of someone trained to catch the thing that does not belong. In the 4th sequence, something that did not belong appeared. The altitude simulation returned a value 40 meters off. The heading data showed a drift outside any acceptable variance. The backup signal weighting was wrong. Not subtly wrong, but structurally wrong, in a way that suggested the input dataset had been corrupted at the source. The room shifted. 2 members of the safety panel leaned forward. A board member reached for her phone. Ryan said, clearly and without alarm, "Stop the sequence." He said it the way an experienced pilot says it, not with panic, but with authority. Because authority in a crisis is what prevents it from becoming something worse. He asked for access to the source log files. He told the room, calmly, that the error was not in Skybridge's architecture, but in the input data, and that he needed 5 minutes with the original calibration files to demonstrate this. Owen spoke before the 5 minutes could be granted. He said, with the measured concern of a man who had been watching the proceedings closely and reluctantly, that they had seen enough, that the system had failed a safety-critical sequence under controlled conditions, that the responsible course of action was to suspend the demonstration and conduct a full internal review, and that Ryan would have every opportunity to explain the discrepancy through proper channels. He said all of this without raising his voice. Diana stood at the front of the room, with 15 faces waiting for her decision. Ryan looked at her from across the simulation suite, and he did not plead, and he did not threaten. He said 4 words with the simplicity of someone who still believed that reasonable people, given the chance, would choose the truth. Check the system log. He said it the way you say it, when you have absolute confidence in the evidence and moderate confidence in the person you are asking to look at it. He was right about the evidence. Diana signed the suspension order at 9:47 that morning, in front of a room full of witnesses, in the small and permanent way that certain decisions are made not because she was certain, but because she was afraid, and because Owen had given her a story she could survive, and because Ryan had not given her one she could easily defend. The company's press office issued a statement that afternoon, noting that a senior engineer had been suspended pending review of safety compliance procedures. The European carrier deferred its decision. Ryan collected the contents of his desk into a cardboard box, put on his coat, and went to the hallway bench where Madison was waiting. She looked at his face and asked if something had gone wrong. He knelt beside her and wiped her eyes before she could cry and said, "Not everything that falls apart is broken, Bug. Sometimes things just need a different kind of repair." Ryan did not contest the suspension publicly. He did not call a lawyer that first week, because he did not have $3,000 for a retainer, and Madison needed new winter boots, and the electricity bill had arrived at a bad time. He made 3 calls in the week after the suspension. 1 to a former colleague who did not call back. 1 to a legal aid clinic that told him cases involving large aviation corporations were outside their scope, and 1 to his mother in Portland, who asked if he needed money. And he said no, and they both understood what no meant. The legal avenue narrowed within a month. He had been in the building. He had been responsible for the system. The company's communications had framed the suspension as precautionary, technically accurate, in the way that a great many corporate communications are technically accurate, precise in every specific detail, and misleading in every important one. Ryan's aviation certification was placed under review pending an internal investigation with no stated timeline, managed by a committee that included Owen Price. He left Chicago in December. He packed a rented minivan with Madison in the back seat, surrounded by garbage bags full of books and winter clothes, and the parts of a disassembled oscilloscope he could not bring himself to leave behind, and drove northwest through 2 days of flat gray sky toward a place where no one knew his name. He settled near Renton, 20 miles from Seattle, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. He found work within 3 weeks at a regional airstrip whose tower communications system had not been serviced in 4 years. The manager hired Ryan for a flat day rate with no questions about references, because the system was broken and Ryan could clearly fix it, and in the trades, that is usually sufficient. He went from there to a charter helicopter maintenance outfit, then to a contract arrangement with 3 private pilots who used a shared hangar in Auburn and needed someone they trusted to keep their aircraft airworthy. None of it was what he had built. All of it was honest, and he was present for it. And he came home smelling of hydraulic fluid and clean wiring, and Madison grew up understanding that her father's hands knew how things worked, and that this was worth more than a title. She never heard him speak with contempt of Diana Monroe. She never heard him speak of Owen Price at all. She understood, in the way that attentive children understand things, that there was a shape to the silence around those years, that something had broken, and her father had decided, in his quiet and final way, not to let the breaking define what came after. She made the decision at 12 years old to study aerospace engineering, she told her father. He sat with it for a moment and then said, "Good. You'll do it better than I did." She had written it on a note card and kept it on her desk for the 8 years since. Diana Monroe, meanwhile, became CEO of Monroe Aerotech in the spring following the Skybridge incident. Owen Price was named to an advisory council. Skybridge was retooled and relaunched under a new name, with Owen listed as the primary architect. Diana signed the paperwork. She flew through Gate 27 at O'Hare on the morning she accepted the title, and she stood at the window and watched a plane push back below her, and felt the weight of something she had done that could not be undone, and she filed that weight away in the place where she kept the things she was not yet ready to confront. In the 15 years that followed, Diana Monroe accumulated the markers of exceptional professional success with the systematic efficiency of someone who has decided that work is the answer to questions she has not yet formed clearly enough to ask. Monroe Aerotech expanded its international footprint. She led 3 major acquisitions, restructured the company's safety certification division, and became one of the most cited executives in commercial aviation. The profiles written about her used words like steely and visionary and uncompromising. She read them and understood that these were the words people use when they are trying to locate a person inside a set of achievements and cannot quite find her. She had not married. She had come close, twice. And both times she had retreated from it in a way she could not fully explain to the other person, except that each time she had begun to see the man across from her too clearly, and what she saw was the absence of someone who had looked at her once with complete and uncritical belief, and whom she had signed a paper to silence. It was not that she had been in love with Ryan for 15 years. It was that she had never found a satisfactory way to set down what she had done to him. Ella Brooks had been her assistant for 4 years, and had learned to read the topography of Diana's silences with precision. She knew that Diana always took the long route through Terminal C when passing through Seattle-Tacoma, adding 6 unnecessary minutes in order to avoid Gate 27. She knew that Diana spent the anniversary of the Skybridge failure every year at her desk, with the original incident file open on her secondary screen, reading through it with the expression of someone trying to find the page where the story could have gone differently. That year, Monroe Aerotech began final development on the Apex Corridor platform, its most ambitious navigation project since Skybridge. The Apex system had been built over a decade on a technical foundation that no one in the organization formally discussed, because that foundation was Ryan Bennett's original Skybridge architecture, retained in Monroe's technical archive, under a different classification heading. Owen had arranged this. He had also arranged to be the face of the Apex rollout, as he had been the face of the original relaunch, moving through the organization with the ease of a man who has long since made peace with his own compromises. Diana did not know the full extent of what Owen had done. She knew enough to feel the shape of it. The conference in Seattle was supposed to be a milestone. She did not yet know it would also be a reckoning. The system failure at Seattle-Tacoma on the night before the Apex conference was not, as Owen Price would later characterize it, a localized anomaly with no connection to Monroe's technology. It was a downstream consequence of the same synchronization logic that sat at the base of both Skybridge and Apex, a fault line in the frequency handshake protocol that Ryan had identified and patched in his original architecture, and that had been quietly removed when Owen's team restructured the codebase for the relaunch. The patch had been considered inelegant. It had been removed in the interest of simplifying the architecture. The person who made the decision did not fully understand what the patch was doing. The system had been running without it for 3 years, and nothing had gone wrong. Until tonight. Ryan recognized the error signature the moment he saw the technician's screen. He had written the original code. He knew what the failure looked like from the outside, in the way that a person recognizes their own handwriting on a page they did not expect to find. He sat with it for a moment. Madison watched him and said nothing, because she had seen this particular stillness in her father, before the stillness that preceded a decision he had already made but had not yet announced. "You know what's wrong," she said. It was not a question. He said yes. She said, "Are you going to help?" He said he was thinking about it. She let him think for 90 seconds, which was about all the situation allowed, and then said there was a medical transport flight on the ground crew board. A pediatric cardiac patient being transferred to Seattle Children's. The clearance caught in the disruption. Ryan stood up. He walked to the workstation without announcing himself or invoking his history or explaining who he was. He simply asked the young technician to show him the frequency assignment log. The technician showed him. Ryan looked at it for 30 seconds, pointed to the source of the conflict, described the rebind sequence in plain language, and told the technician to make the change and watch the cascade clear. The technician hesitated because the man was a stranger in a canvas jacket, and this was a critical system, and then something in Ryan's voice, which carried the certainty of someone who has spent 20 years being right about exactly this kind of thing, resolved the hesitation. The technician made the change. The cascade cleared. The medical transport received its ground clearance 3 minutes later. The gate area had gone quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something loud has suddenly stopped. The technician stood in a loose cluster near the workstation. Marcus Webb was trying to say something grateful and finding no words equal to it, because Ryan had already stepped back. He was looking for his coffee when Diana reached him. She had been close enough to watch the whole sequence, his hands on the keyboard, the familiar economy of his movements, the way the room had rearranged itself around his certainty. She understood, in the space of a few seconds, 3 separate things: that the error in the system was connected to Skybridge, that Ryan had fixed it without anyone asking him to, and that she was looking at a man who had spent 15 years building the kind of authority that does not need a title because it does not need to be recognized by anyone to exist. "Ryan," she said, "I've been looking for you for years." He looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not forgiveness. It was something more difficult than either the expression of someone who has stopped needing the thing they are being offered. He said, "No. You've been looking for absolution. I spent those years keeping the lights on and getting my daughter to school on time." Madison was standing 12 feet away. She looked at Diana with clear, steady eyes that contained the entirety of the 15 years her father had spent not telling her what Diana had done. Diana looked back at her and did not look away, because she had enough self-awareness left to understand that looking away would be worse. Diana told Ella to pull the complete Skybridge incident file that night, in the hotel room at 11 o'clock, with the conference less than 14 hours away. She told Ella not to tell Owen. She said it twice, which was once more than she usually said anything. Ella had been expecting this conversation for 4 years, and had a folder already prepared, not the official incident summary, but the raw archive, the original log exports, the access records, the communication metadata, the 3 memos that had reached the board in the month before the demonstration. She had pulled them 6 months ago. When she noticed something in the Apex platform documentation that did not align with the original Skybridge attribution record, she had not said anything, because Diana had not yet been ready to hear it. They went through it together. The frequency assignment log from the night of the Skybridge demonstration showed modification timestamps from 37 minutes before the test sequence began. Modifications made through an administrator account registered to a shared server in Owen Price's department. Ryan's own access logs showed no activity on that file for the 12 hours preceding the test. The 3 memos that had reached the board were authored under account credentials used from a terminal in Owen's office suite. The safety assessment submitted under a colleague's name was written in a prose style that did not match the colleague's other communications and cited a dataset that did not exist in the official testing record. And the Apex platform's core routing algorithm identified in its documentation as Owen Price's original contribution matched. At the architecture level, the algorithm Ryan had drawn on Diana's whiteboard 15 years ago. Ella laid it out without commentary, because she was good at her job, and being good at her job sometimes meant delivering information that should have been delivered years earlier. Diana sat with it for several minutes. When she spoke, she said only, "How long have you known?" Ella said, 6 months. Diana nodded. She did not ask why Ella had not come forward sooner, because she understood. She had not been ready. And Ella had known she had not been ready. And this was the particular failure of leaders, who make themselves too opaque. The people around them learn to withhold the truth until the leader has manufactured an internal permission slip to receive it. Diana added this to the list of things she had gotten wrong. The next morning, she drove to the aviation maintenance facility in Renton that she had found through a regional directory. The building was a converted industrial space with sliding metal doors and the smell of lubricant and clean wiring that reminded her, despite herself, of the Monroe Aerotech Technical Lab at 2 in the morning 15 years ago. Ryan was at a workbench with a disassembled radio altimeter, and Madison was at a separate table with her laptop, and a dog of uncertain ancestry was asleep on a folded tarp near the door. Ryan looked up. He did not seem surprised to see her, which meant he had known the night before that she would eventually come. She told him what Ella had found, reading the key points from the document without editorializing. And she watched his face, which showed nothing she could identify as vindication or relief, because this was the face of someone who has known the truth for 15 years and has long since stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. He told her then the things he had tried to do in the month after his suspension, the emails to the board that were returned undeliverable, the legal consultation that priced his case out of reach, the single attempt to reach Diana directly through a former colleague who said the contact request had been flagged for review. He told her about the risk register, the informal industry-wide safety list maintained between major carriers, and how it had closed every door he had not already lost. He said all of this without bitterness, in the flat and precise register of someone filing a report on a system that had failed. When he finished, He looked at her and said, "I chose Madison over the fight. I would choose her again. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked. And you finally deserve an honest answer." Diana had no self-defense left. She had used the last of it reading the files the night before. Owen Price learned about the investigation through a board member's assistant, who made a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that set off a sequence of rapid adjustments Owen was very good at making. He moved first to the narrative. Because the narrative is always more important than the facts in the initial hours of any crisis. He scheduled a call with 3 board members for Wednesday morning and prepared a packet characterizing Ryan Bennett as a man suspended for legitimate safety reasons who had reappeared at a moment of maximum vulnerability for Monroe Aerotech. At the invitation of a CEO who had a documented prior relationship with him. Owen told the board that Diana was making a decision based on personal history rather than fiduciary obligation. He said that rehabilitating Ryan Bennett at the Apex conference would expose Monroe Aerotech to retrospective liability claims, destabilize the company's insurance arrangements, and signal to international partners that the organization's leadership was susceptible to sentiment. He said all of this in the tone of reluctant concern that was his most refined instrument. 2 board members called Diana within an hour of Owen's presentation. They were measured but clear, asking whether the timing was appropriate, using the phrase personal entanglement. Diana listened without interruption, thanked them for their concern, and said she would take their perspective into account. She then called a 3rd board member, one who had not been on Owen's list, and told her what Ella had found. This board member had been at Monroe Aerotech for 11 years and had a long memory for technical details and a low tolerance for people who obscured them. She listened. She asked 2 questions. Then she said, "Bring Ryan to the conference." Madison was the one who finally persuaded him. He had declined Diana's invitation, not from spite, but from a reasonable assessment that participating in the Apex conference, surrounded by the industry that had listed him as a liability, was unlikely to proceed without a quality of spectacle he had no interest in. He had built something in Renton, his work, his daughter, and the 8 pilots who trusted him to tell them the truth about their aircraft. He did not need a stage. Madison sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "You always told me the truth doesn't need to be loud to matter. But a truth that stays silent long enough starts to look like a lie." Ryan looked at his coffee for a while. Then he looked at her. "When did you get this good at arguing?" She said she had learned from him. He called Diana the next morning and agreed to attend as an independent technical advisor with 3 conditions. His participation would be documented in writing. Madison's name would appear nowhere in any Monroe Aerotech communication without her explicit approval. And if at any point the proceedings felt like theater rather than accountability, he would leave and Diana would not try to stop him. Diana agreed to all 3 without hesitation, which told Ryan something important. She was not managing him. She was trying at 45, to be honest. In a way she should have been at 30. The Apex Aviation Systems Conference convened on Thursday morning in a glass-walled venue on the Seattle waterfront, with views of Puget Sound that proved distracting in the way that beautiful things are distracting when the business at hand is serious. 400 delegates were present, representing carriers, regulatory bodies, engineering certification panels, and investment firms with interests in commercial aviation infrastructure. The press section held 12 journalists. Owen Price had arrived early and had positioned himself near the front, in a chair with a direct sightline to the podium, in the manner of a man who intends to control the room from within it. He spoke in the morning session, as scheduled, framing the Apex platform with his customary fluency, the technical achievements, the safety validation history, the 15 years of development that had brought the system to this point. He mentioned Skybridge once, briefly, in the context of the original safety concerns that had led to its restructuring, and he used the passive voice with the skill of someone who has learned that the passive voice distributes responsibility into the air and allows it to dissipate. Diana took the podium after the lunch break. She had written 3 drafts of what she was about to say, and had discarded all 3 during the night. What she said now was not a version, it was just the truth arranged in the order in which she had been able to face it. She said that Monroe Aerotech was prepared to release the complete technical documentation on the Skybridge platform and the Apex architecture. She said a compliance review had identified significant discrepancies in the attribution records for both systems. She said that the engineer who had developed the foundational architecture for Skybridge, and whose work was present in the core of every version of the system deployed since, had not been credited, compensated, or acknowledged in any Monroe Aerotech documentation for 15 years. She said this was the result of a deliberate act of concealment that the company had failed to identify, investigate, or correct, and that the consequences had been borne by one person at significant personal and professional cost. She said, "I signed the order that ended Ryan Bennett's career in this industry. I did so without examining the evidence I had been asked to examine. I was afraid of what that examination might cost me, and I chose my own position over a man's livelihood and reputation. I have no adequate explanation for this. I can only account for it honestly and accept the responsibility that accounting requires." The room went quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when the statement made from the front of it is not the statement anyone expected. Ryan walked to the front when Diana nodded to him. He did not use notes. He opened the log file on the conference display, the original, unmodified log, stored on an encrypted drive he had carried for 15 years, with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness with which he kept backups of everything that mattered, and walked the room through it. The modification timestamps, the access account, the correlation between the 3 board memos and the terminal records in Owen's office suite, the structural identity between the Apex core algorithm and the architecture he had drawn on Diana's whiteboard in the fall of a year, that many people in this room had not yet joined the industry. He presented it without drama, without elevation, without the language of grievance. He was describing a system that had failed, and showing exactly how and where and why. Owen stood and offered 3 sentences of rebuttal that were not technically rebuttals, they were characterizations, and characterizations require an audience willing to receive them as facts, and this room was no longer that audience. Ella came forward with a second set of documents. The financial records showing the licensing fees Monroe Aerotech had collected on the Apex platform, the internal routing that directed a portion of those fees to a consulting arrangement benefiting Owen Price directly, and the correspondence from 18 months ago, in which Owen had argued against a routine audit of the Skybridge attribution record by calling it unnecessary administrative overhead. The board member who had told Diana to bring Ryan to the conference stood from her seat in the 3rd row and said, in a clear and carrying voice, that she was calling for an immediate suspension of Owen Price's advisory role, pending a full independent review. Owen left the room. Madison had not planned to speak. She stood because something in her, trained by years of watching her father absorb silence as a discipline, could no longer be contained by it. She said, "My father never told me your name. He never spoke about this in our house. He got me to school every morning. He showed up for every recital and every competition and every bad day I had and every good one. He built something real and honest, and something he did not need to destroy anyone else to build. I'm not asking you to give him anything. I'm just telling you what kind of man he is, in case anyone forgot." Diana was crying before Madison finished. She did not cover it. Ryan placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, steadily, the way he placed his hand on everything he wanted to hold without gripping. He said nothing. He did not need to. The formal resolution came over the following weeks. The legal team, the board review, the independent auditor's report, the communications to regulators, the corrected attribution filings. Owen Price's consulting arrangement was terminated. The Apex platform documentation was revised to reflect Ryan's authorship of the foundational architecture. Monroe Aerotech's legal office filed the paperwork to remove Ryan's name from the industry risk register. a process that took longer than it should have, because the register was maintained informally and no one had designed a protocol for corrections. Ryan accepted the retroactive compensation the company offered. He did not accept the role of Chief Technology Officer, which Diana offered in person on a Friday morning in her office, with the sound visible through the window and Ella diplomatically absent. He said he had a business in Renton that depended on him, and was not interested in trading one form of institutional dependency for another, even a better decorated one. He agreed, however, to a formal partnership arrangement, with 3 conditions stated without negotiation: that Monroe Aerotech establish an internal fund supporting engineers who had experienced wrongful attribution or suppressed safety disclosures, that the company implement a protected whistleblower pathway with independent oversight, and that the complete Skybridge authorship record be made publicly available in the industry technical registry, not as a press release, but as a permanent correction to the professional record. Diana agreed to all 3. She would spend the next 18 months implementing them, and they would outlast her tenure, and she understood that this was the right shape for the resolution. Not something that lived in her reputation, but something that lived in the structure of the institution she had failed to hold to account. Diana asked to meet him at the airport on the day he was flying back. He agreed, because she had asked plainly. And he had decided, in the deliberate and final way that he made decisions, that plain requests deserved plain responses. They met at Gate 27. The gate was quiet on a Thursday afternoon, a domestic route. Half full. Departure in 40 minutes. Ryan sat in the same kind of seat he had been sitting in during the night of the crisis, and Diana sat across from him, and there was no chaos between them this time, which meant there was nothing to deflect attention from what needed to be said. Diana spoke first. She said she had been afraid the night of the Skybridge demonstration, afraid of the board and the contract, and the perception of incompetence, and the accumulated weight of 2 years of being told she was provisional, conditional, never quite enough for the room she was in. She said Owen had handed her a story she could survive, and she had taken it, and the fact that it cost someone else everything had not been enough to stop her. She said she had spent 15 years winning a version of her career that had a false bottom in it. That every time she signed a technical document, or sat at the head of a table full of people who did not know the things she knew about herself, she felt it give slightly, the way floors give in old buildings, just enough to remind you that the structure is not entirely sound. She was not asking him for anything. She was trying, at 45, to be honest in a way she should have been at 30, and she understood the time gap could not be remedied by an apology, only acknowledged. Ryan listened. He had always been a good listener, the stillness with which he received information, as though it deserved to be taken seriously before it was responded to. When she finished, he said he did not hate her. He said he had spent the first 2 years after Chicago in the vicinity of hatred, which was exhausting in the particular way of a fire that has nothing left to burn. He said what had replaced it was not forgiveness in the sense of erasure, but something closer to a decision. A decision that the years ahead of him were not going to be organized around the years behind him, and that his daughter was going to grow up in a house that smelled of work and honesty and not of grievance. He was telling her this not to make her feel better, but because she had been honest with him, and he had decided to be honest back. He had let it go, and it had been hard, and he was glad he had. Madison arrived at the gate 20 minutes before boarding and said nothing when she saw Diana. But she nodded the brief, composed nod of someone willing to begin from here. From this point, without pretending the distance behind them did not exist. Diana nodded back. The boards above them updated. The flight was on time. Ryan looked up at the gate display, and then at Diana, and said, "Some whites get delayed 15 years, but if they land safe, they still count." He picked up his bag. Madison stood. They walked together toward the jet bridge. Unhurried. In the quiet way of people who have somewhere to be, and know they will get there. Diana watched them go. She stood alone at gate 27 for a long while, in the place where the story had begun, and let it end.